Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful and very inspiring day, and thanks so much for joining me today for another art video. This week I felt like doing something fun, something a little bit looser and more experimental than at least most of the things I share here at my channel. And I thought of filming my painting process so that I could share how I went about creating this one step by step. Alright, so without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with sharing my preliminary sketching process. I'm going to be using my HB pencil as always and drawing as lightly as possible so that I can easily erase mistakes as I am sketching this freehand, and I also don't have that pencil work visible at the end through my transparent paint. It's also very important to draw as lightly as possible so that you can stay away from damaging or scratching your watercolor paper. I created this little composition from imagination after having seen a bunch of different beautiful window pictures on Google and also on Pinterest. I kind of combined different things that I liked about them and planned my own little color scheme that I thought would look nice. A lot of the times when I am sketching architectural elements from buildings and houses and things like that, I like helping myself with straight vertical lines or straight horizontal lines, especially if it's a flat view like we have with this window. Of course, if there are several different houses or several different buildings and there is a linear perspective, 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, or that kind of thing going on, then I also make sure to notice the angles created by diagonal lines and things like that. But because this one is a front flat kind of view of this window, as you saw in the beginning, I lay down straight verticals and straight horizontals, and then I use those to make sure that I am utilizing my drawing space effectively and creating some sort of symmetry in those shapes throughout the window. And I really applied lots of the same ideas and principles that I've shared in past freehand sketching videos in terms of making sure that I am focusing on largest, most important shapes first and adding in smaller shapes and details later after those larger shapes have been laid down. I'm going to make sure to leave a couple of links on past videos that I've created and resources on freehand sketching down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check them out. For the flower pots on the floor right below the window, I also wanted to make sure to incorporate curves so that these little 3D structures could actually look like a slightly tapered cylindrical form. And these kinds of structures have curves and not straight lines. However, from this perspective, the look of those curves along the top and the bottom of those flower pots is really very, very slight, very subtle. I also made sure to place the ground line slightly above that bottom curve of these flower pots so that they didn't seem like they were floating in the air or something like that. And finally, I finished up with placing the more irregular, organic, abstract shapes created by those plant areas that I would be adding in later. The only thing I didn't add into the sketch that I'm going to be painting in later is the tree. And I just did that completely with my paintbrush. Alright, so with our preliminary sketch out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with our painting process. For this piece, I only used 6 different colors, and these are all from my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set. The specific colors that I used were cadmium lemon, raw sienna, burnt sienna, green, madder lake red light, and azure. Now, with the White Nights sets from St. Petersburg, they just call this green green, but something like a sap green or a hooker's green could do the trick just fine. You can also replace the cadmium lemon with any yellow you'd like. The azure can be replaced with any blue, even the ultramarine blue or French ultramarine blue. Something to note about the blue is that I use it to create grays. Do you notice that light gray throughout those window sections, the white sections in the window? I created that gray by mixing together my azure with my burnt sienna. So I would recommend testing out the blue that you choose and mixing it together with your brown that you're going to be using to make sure that it allows you to create a nice looking gray. And finally, for the red, this is for the flowers. I'm going to be dropping it into those previous greens that I laid down while they're still wet, so that that red can dissipate out and be blurred out into those greens. I decided to use more of a cooler red because I like it more than the warmer reds, but you can use whatever kind of red you like, or even just completely change the color for something like a purple, or even bring in a yellow for those flowers. It's entirely up to you and how colorful you want to make the piece. Okay, so right here I'm getting started with creating my first two color mixtures on my color mixing palette. These are nice, juicy color mixtures with a good amount of color in them, but you can see how much water they also have. There's a lot of movement and fluidity to these color mixtures that I am creating. Essentially, I created a lighter golden brown and a bit of a darker reddish brown, and all it is the mixture on the left in the little circle there is raw sienna plus a little bit of burnt sienna, and then the other one is pure burnt sienna with some water in it. With my first two color mixtures ready, it was time to switch on over to my larger mop brush. This is a size 6 mop brush from Princeton's Neptune line. I swiveled my paintbrush in my container of water to pre-moisten those bristles, removed the excess water, and went right in to load up my paintbrush with that first lightest color mixture, the golden brown, the lightest brown that you create for yourself. That's the one that you want to initially go in with. And as you can see, using this larger mop brush, I'm able to move fast. I am able to go right in with a good amount of water and paint in my bristles. And what I am doing, especially because I am painting on dry paper, I have not pre-wetted anything, I have to move fast. When we're painting on paper that is dry, things are going to dry pretty quickly versus when you take time to do pre-wetting with clean water, which I've shown in other tutorials that I'll make sure to link to down below. Usually the paint is going to dry a lot more slowly and you have more working time to move that paint around a little bit if needed. But for this one, I am really trying to keep things nice and loose. I'm going right in on dry paper, and all of this requires me working pretty quickly. And whatever little irregularities, effects, or imperfections happen along the way, I am just going to embrace them. Remember that when it comes to painting with watercolor, it's very easy to start overworking everything. So go in with confidence and leave things be as much as possible, because that is going to lead to a looser, fresher look at the end. And so I'm making my way down that paper, adding in this first layer of lighter brown in a semi-translucent state. Whenever I feel I've gone in with way too much color, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I remove the excess water and go back in with only a bit of water in my paintbrush to further pull out that color and distribute that color amongst a wider area or a larger area, which is going to soften that color. I don't want to go in with super saturated color right off the bat because I want this wall to look overall pretty light and pale, and I don't want to create flatness. I want to make sure that this wall has a nice variation in both values and translucencies at the end. I did my best to work around the flower pots and those nooks and crannies created by the plant shapes and just the flower pot shapes. If you're more comfortable switching to a smaller paintbrush to paint in those areas, then you can certainly feel free to do that. But I would make sure to, again, work pretty fast. As you can see, I am doing my best to continue pulling that bead, that color that is still wet, into this new area that I am painting in before it dries. And in many cases, I am even going back over certain little spaces to make sure that that initial lighter brown layer is still wet before I start dropping in the darker brown, which I'm going to start doing in just a bit here, because if this initial layer of light brown, the golden brown, dries, then the paint color that comes next is not going to bleed and dissipate and create nice blurred out effects. into that previous layer. So here I am dropping in the darker brown. This is the pure burnt sienna color mixture with a bit of water in it. And you can see how, because that previous layer is still wet, this burnt sienna is dissipating out, bleeding out into that previous color, creating nice soft edges. I'm just dropping in the second brown in areas that I want to darken within that initial lighter brown big area. So I'm imagining areas of cast shadow beneath these flower pots and beneath the plants under the window, stuff like that. Wherever I think that cast shadows would happen, that's essentially where I am placing this next brown. If you're just getting started with watercolor and you're finding it very difficult to stay loose, to work quickly, I would highly, highly recommend practicing using medium to larger sized brushes. Essentially what I do is I try using the largest brush that I feel I can get away with for the little painting or specific area that I am painting in. As long as the brush comes to a pretty fine point, try to use the largest brush that you can get away with, because obviously the smaller the brush, the less loading up of water and color you're going to be able to do. The more you're going to have to go back and forth between your color palette and back to your painting, and that is most likely going to lead to your painting drying faster and to splotchiness and patchiness and undesired effects. All right, so I switched on over to my size 14 round brush for this next part of the painting process. I'm going to be painting in the windows, so the sections through which we can see into the house. That's what I am painting in right now. And what I did was I created that dark gray for myself by mixing together my blue with my dark brown. Mixing together blue and dark brown is a great way to create a nice, rich, vibrant gray that actually you can switch and shift the color temperature of that gray by adding more blue or more brown into it as you go, so that these gray sections can have a variety of values and tones within them, as well as translucencies and color temperatures. So I really like creating my own dark gray color mixtures so that I can have the nice variety or play with color in these areas, instead of using something like a ready-made black, like an ivory black or a Mars black or something like that, which initially, when we're just getting started, we might feel inclined to reach for these blacks to create our grays, right? Just water that black down and use it in a semi-translucent state and you'll get your gray, right? But usually ready-made blacks like those are very flat, very neutral, and tend to dull out the beautiful vibrant color use that we're trying to create. And so it's so helpful to start looking into how to create our own vibrant, rich, dark blacks or even dark colors when it comes to painting with watercolor. There are so many different quote-unquote recipes that you can use to create your darks, and using a mixture of blue and dark brown is just one of these mixtures. So essentially I created my gray. I tested it out on my scrap piece of watercolor paper. I showed this on screen just a moment ago to ensure that I had a base gray. And then I actually changed the ratios of my colors in that color mixture as I went. I added in more blue and I added in more brown as I went ahead painting these little squares. Another thing that I want to point out here is notice how I am not going in super saturated, super dark. I want to make sure that I am staying away from flatness, especially when we're using a color that is already very dark like this. I am making sure that I am going in with a bit of water in my paintbrush from time to time and watering that color down in certain sections. And right here, I'm even doing some lifting while that color is still wet, so that I can make certain sections look a little bit more translucent. Because a ton of saturation with a color that is already very dark can certainly lead to a lot of flatness and heaviness. Notice as well how I left little teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through to create the illusion of just light reflections on that glass, little highlights. Okay, so it's time to paint in those plants. So I created 3 color mixtures for myself on my color mixing palette before jumping in. I'm gonna be using my same paintbrush. This is my size 6 round brush. I just made sure to rinse all of the previous color out very, very well. And what I made sure to prepare for myself on my color mixing palette was a light green, a darker green, and also my red. And I added in a teeny tiny bit of my green into that red to tone it down just a little bit. Green is complementary or opposite to red in the color wheel, which means that by adding in a little bit of green into my red, I would tone down that saturation of that red a little bit, make it look a little bit more natural. You can definitely make a darker red as well by adding in a green. This is just something that you can do in case you like more realistic colors, because colors are not very realistic. At least many of them are not when you just, use them straight out of the pan or tube. Or simply if you're more into muted out colors. Not all of us like very vibrant colors. So I created my lighter green by mixing together my cadmium, lemon, and my green. And then the darker green is just plain green, and the red that I created is my Madder Lake red light with a teeny tiny bit of that green in it. As you can see, these 3 color mixtures are nice and juicy, just like the first ones that I created for myself. They have a good amount of water, but also plenty of color or pigment in them, so that I can make sure that I am going to be able to just do a good amount of work with these color mixtures. And also, if I want to water down or make a color look lighter, I can bring out a little bit of that color mixture into another well of my color mixing palette and add a little bit of water into that while still keeping my first color mixture there for me in case I want to use the color in a more saturated state. What happens when we start out with a very diluted, super watered down color on our color mixing palette is that we have to remember that every single time we dip our paintbrush into our container of water, which happens very frequently as we're painting with watercolor, every single time you go into that container, you're going to be bringing out at least a little tiny bit of water into your color mixtures, and you're going to dilute them further. Then you're most likely going to feel the need to constantly grab more paint, add more paint into your color mixture, or you're gonna feel the need to go in with another layer of paint to darken a certain area or make a color look more vibrant or whatever it is. And with this style of painting, I'm really trying to go in with just one layer as much as possible. I want it loose, I want it fresh, and I want to be able to do the most work, the most description in terms of both color, value, and textures that I possibly can with just one layer of paint. And so it's important to prepare our sets of color mixtures in such a way that, they are going to support us in doing that. So I am using a mixture of scribbling, using just the tip of my paintbrush, gently touching it down in different ways, doing little imperfect, irregular side-to-side moves, and also simultaneously moving my paintbrush up and down. So up and down and side-to-side simultaneously, sometimes even little loops this way and that way. And in the central part of the plants, I'm actually bringing down the belly of my paintbrush, touching down the belly of my paintbrush in different ways at different angles to create larger abstract shapes. So I'm not doing scribbling using just the tip of my paintbrush all throughout the plants. I'm also in certain areas touching the entire belly of my paintbrush down on my paper, but really thinking of all of these green shapes in a very abstract way, in a very irregular way, and really staying away from creating any sort of patterns that are not going to look very natural and that are going to make everything look very stiff. I'm looking for asymmetry, I'm looking for irregularity, and I'm looking for imperfection along the way. It's super important to keep those things in mind when you are painting in something that's organic and natural, such as plants and trees and rocks and that kind of thing. As I am using these techniques, I am shifting and changing between both of my greens, as well as also dropping in my red where I want to create the illusion of little red flowers. And the trick here is to continue working fast to add in that next green while that previous green shape that you created is still wet, so that those greens can continue merging together and softening, creating gradients into each other. And if you want those flowers to bleed and blur out the way that mine are doing here, you also have to make sure that you are dropping in that red while those greens underneath it are still wet. One thing there as well, before dropping in my little red flowers, I make sure to remove all of the green from my paintbrush bristles by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water, and then I go into my red. Otherwise, because green and red are complementaries in the color wheel, if you're not mindful of removing your green from your paintbrush bristles before going into your red, you may all of a sudden end out with a very muted out red, brownish, grayish red, and it's not going to look very bright as you probably want your flowers to look. All right, so right here I am getting started with painting in the flower pots on the ground. And as always, I create at least 2 different color mixtures for myself, one lighter brown and one darker brown, so that I can start developing a little bit of a sense of dimension and 3D form, even in this very loose piece. So the 2 browns that I prepared for myself are basically a burnt sienna with a bit of water in it. So the same color mixture that I was using for the wall and the ground, that's what I'm going in initially with. And while that initial burnt sienna layer is still wet, I am dropping in my darker brown only into certain sections. And this dark brown color mixture is a mixture of burnt sienna plus a little bit of my azure, my blue, which is going to create that dark brown. So it's a dark brown that we actually already used in the little windows. So remember how those little squares for the windows were painted in with a combo of blue plus dark brown, and how we were mixing, shifting and changing the ratios of those colors in that color mixture as we went. So that same dark brown that you use to paint in the squares for the windows is the same dark brown that you are using to darken certain areas in those pots. Make sure that you're dropping in the darker brown while that initial layer of brown is still wet, so that you can get those nice diffused out, softened edges. And the gray that I use to paint in the bucket, which I'm going to be adding that little final detail later on after everything has dried, but the gray that I used was, you guessed it, I just mixed together my azure, which is my blue that I am using for this piece, with my dark brown that I am using for this piece, which is my burnt sienna. I mixed together a kind of 50-50 amount of each, and I tested out this color mixture on my scrap piece of paper until it looked gray, and then I just painted in the bucket with this gray. Initially, I went in with this gray in a semi-translucent state, and then I dropped in a little bit more, only into certain sections within that I wanted to darken further. After painting in that first layer in the flower pots and the bucket, it was time to start painting in the doors for the window. Are these French doors? I don't even know. If you know, leave me a comment below. I'm terrible at that kind of thing. But these wooden doors on both sides of the window is what I'm painting in right now, and I am using my dark brown, which again is just a mixture of my azure, my dark blue, with my dark brown that I am using, which is burnt sienna. It's the same color mixture that I was just using for the bucket, only this time I added more of the burnt sienna into it so that it would look like a dark brown instead of a gray. Dark blue plus dark brown is a color mixture that is super versatile. I keep coming back to it almost for every single one of my pieces, because you can just one same color mixture, shift it and change it, add more brown into it if you want it more warm based, want it more towards the brown side, add more blue to it. If you want it more cool based and you want it more towards the blue side, or have kind of a 50-50 amount if you need a gray. So it's super versatile and I often use it. And sometimes I use Mars brown for my brown, sometimes I use burnt umber for my brown, sometimes I use cobalt blue for my blue, sometimes I use ultramarine for my blue, and in this case I'm just using the azure, and I would highly recommend checking it out and exploring it if you haven't already. For those wooden doors, as you can see, I made sure to develop at least somewhat of a variety of translucencies and saturation so that I could stay away from flatness, and I added in a little bit of a cast shadow effect right behind the plants. Kind of that are overlapping over those doors. So it's always about going in with that color in a semi-translucent state initially, and then going in with a little bit more of that color while that initial layer is still wet and dropping it into certain sections that you want to darken. If that initial layer dries on you, then it's totally okay to go in and darken certain sections on that dry paper if you want. It's just that in those cases, if you're painting on dry paper, the edges of your shapes are going to be sharp and defined and not soft and blurred out. All right, so after painting in those wooden doors on either side of that window, I am now adding in some details in those leaves, wet on dry. So everything all throughout these plants is completely dry. So you can see how these little leaf shapes that I am very quickly, very loosely adding in with my size 4 round brush. I'm barely touching just the tip of my paintbrush, pressing down a little bit, and that creates a nice little leaf shape. And because I am painting these in on dry paper, the edges of these little shapes are sharp and defined. So I'm adding a little bit more interest to the piece by adding these details, and also by making sure that I am playing with both wet on wet as well as wet on dry. I am creating a little bit more interest and impact and depth to the piece. All right, so it's time to add in that tree on the upper left corner of this piece. I get started with painting in the leaves, and again I am using the lighter green and the darker green. The lighter green is created with my cadmium lemon plus a little bit of my green, and the darker green is just plain green with some water in it. Initially, I am going in with the lighter green. I am doing some bouncing. This is the bouncing technique. It's very similar to what I was just doing with those little leaf shapes that I was painting in wet on dry. All I am doing is pressing down my paintbrush in very irregular ways and doing my bouncing. And that creates a little shape that kind of communicates or describes leaves. And I always make sure to leave little sections of space in between those leaves that I am painting in, because yes, there should be some overlapping with lots of these leaf shapes, but it's important that you leave little windows through which you can see the background through the leaves. Because otherwise, again, you're going to create a blob, a green blob, and it's not going to look very realistic, and it could even lead to flatness. Almost always when you see a tree in real life, you have those little windows in between its leaves through which you're able to see the background, the sky, the grass, or whatever it is behind the tree. Okay, so with those leaves for that tree painted in, I switched on over to my size 1 round brush, and I painted in a thin tree trunk and some branches in between those leaves. And this is the brown that I was just using before, the dark brown that I created by mixing together my azure and my burnt sienna. After doing that initial layer of brown that I used for those windows was already pretty dry, and it was time to go in and add a faint illusion of that design throughout those wooden sections. And this is just the same brown that I was using before. And I really was just describing that in a very minimal, loose kind of way. So I mostly thought of abstract, darker brown shapes created by shadows as I was loosely painting in those shapes. And I was really staying away from doing any outlines or trying to draw anything super perfectly. After adding in that detail into those doors, I then added in a teeny tiny bit more blue into that dark brown to make it a little tiny bit more grayed out. And then I painted in the ground under the flower pots in a semi-translucent way. And while that initial layer of very, very dark, almost grayed out brown was still wet, I dropped in a little bit more of this very dark brown in cast shadow areas right beneath the flower pots. I try to keep the shadow consistent all throughout this piece. So all of the shadows that I am adding in are mostly on the lower right side of the elements, unless they are right below the elements. It's so important that when we are adding in those shadow effects that we keep the light source in mind. If we decided initially that the light source would be on the upper left or upper right, we have to make sure that we keep shadows consistent if we're looking for a believable look. All right, so this is officially the final part of this process. I am adding in some final details. I want to make sure to at least create a little bit of a development of different values and shadow effects in the white window sections. For this, I added in more blue into my blue and brown color mixture so that I could get it more towards the 50-50 ratio. Made sure that I test out my color mixture on my scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that it looked gray to me. And then I went in with this gray only into certain little sections where it would make sense that there would be some shadow created, and just added very faint pale detail in other sections throughout the window, making sure that I left plenty of white so that at the end, these sections of the window actually looked white. All right, so then it was time to start creating a little bit of an illusion of bricks right on top of that window. For this, I just went right in with my size 1-inch flat brush. Sometimes I like going in with my larger flat brush when it comes to painting in more geometric-y type shapes or linear kind of shapes because it allows me to go in loosely and quickly. I used initially my burnt sienna plus watercolor mixture, and then I dropped in some dark brown only into certain sections while that burnt sienna was still wet, which is the same dark brown that I was using before to paint in the wood doors on either side of the window, which is the combo of my burnt sienna plus my azure. Right here I am going in and adding final little details. This is my size 1 round brush, and I am using the same dark brown color mixture that I was just using before to add in some little twigs in all of the plants. You can decide if you want to add all of these twigs in with your dark brown or even with your darker green. You can do a combo of both, but just make sure that you're keeping everything very irregular and that you're not creating any obvious looking patterns. Right here I'm using this same dark brown to finish up with some final details in the wooden doors, and also pushing some little dark sections in the bricks, and also adding in some details with this dark brown in the flower pots on the ground. Okay, and finally, just to finish up this piece, I'm gonna be creating the illusion of cast shadow created by that tree on the wall behind it and the elements behind it. And I am simply just adding in, painting in these shapes with the same color that I was using for that underneath layer that I had already painted in these different areas. So for example, these leaves that I am painting in on the wall were painted in with that color mixture that I was initially using for the wall, which is a mixture of my raw sienna plus a little bit of burnt sienna. And then the reflections of leaves, or the shadows that I add in right now on the actual squares in those windows, are painted in with the same color combo that I was using to paint in those squares, which is my blue plus dark brown color mixture. And then the other little leaf shapes that I paint in, for example, on this wooden door on the left to the window, are painted in with that same dark brown that I was using to paint in that door. Right here I am going in with a very translucent burnt sienna plus raw sienna color mixture to create a little bit of a shadow on either side of those wooden doors. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!